On the evening of August 6, 1930, Judge Joseph Force Crater had dinner at Billy Haas's Chop House on West 45th Street near the theater district around Times Square. He was 41 years old, newly appointed to the New York Supreme Court, and very comfortable among the overlapping circles of law, politics, private clubs, and Broadway nightlife. With him were William Klein, a lawyer and friend, and Sally Lou Ritz, a young showgirl. The dinner itself might have passed unnoticed if the rest of the day had not already seemed unusual. Earlier, Crater had gone through papers in his courthouse chambers, had more than $5,000 withdrawn in cash, brought files or briefcases back to his apartment on Fifth Avenue, and arranged for a theater ticket to a show called Dancing Partner. After dinner, the story becomes less certain than the legend suggests. Klein and Ritz originally gave the version of the story that became famous, Crater stepping into a taxi and disappearing into Manhattan. But they later gave a different account, saying that they were the ones who took the cab while Crater walked away into the city. Either way, after leaving that restaurant, Joseph Force Crater was never seen again. Nearly a month passed before his absence became public. By then, the papers, the cash, the ticket, the dinner, and the disputed exit had already begun to harden into one of New York's strangest mysteries. But before Crater became the headline, "The Missingest Man in New York," he was a newly appointed judge in a city where courts, politics, money, and favors were never seen as separate as they were supposed to be. Crater wasn't a household name before he vanished, but he was not obscure either. He was a lawyer who had worked his way into New York's crowded legal and political circles, where careers often depended on more than courtroom skill. Ability mattered, but so did introductions, loyalty, club memberships, and the quiet approval of men who could turn a recommendation into an appointment. Crater was born in Pennsylvania and came to New York as a young man, building a career in law during a period when the city's courts were closely tied to its political machine. By 1930, he had risen high enough to receive one of the appointments that could change a lawyer's life. In April of that year, Governor Franklin D. Roosevelt appointed him to the New York Supreme Court. Now, that title can be a little misleading. In New York, the Supreme Court is not the highest court in the state, and it is not connected to the United States Supreme Court. It is a major trial court with judges who handle serious civil and criminal matters. In the circles Crater moved through, a seat on the bench carried status, influence, and political value. For a man who had spent years moving through legal and political circles, it was a major step forward. Crater was described at about 6 feet tall, solidly built, neatly dressed, and socially at ease. He knew lawyers, politicians, theater people, and the clubmen who formed part of New York's informal power structure. He was married to Stella Crater, and that summer the two of them had been spending time at Belgrade Lakes in Maine, away from the heat and pressure of the city. Stella would later become one of the central figures in the case, partly because she was one of the last people close to him before the final trip to New York, and partly because of what she found months afterward. But at the beginning, she was simply his wife, waiting for him to return from a trip that, at least on the surface, did not seem permanent. The picture that emerges is not of a man standing outside the system, but of someone firmly inside it. Crater had reached the bench through the same network of ambition, favor, and political usefulness that shaped much of New York public life. That does not make him guilty of anything by itself, but it does mean that when he disappeared, people didn't only look at his private habits, they looked at the city around him and at the men who helped put him where he was. New York was not only a city of courts, newspapers, theaters, clubs, and endless movement. It was also a city of arrangements, or corruption. For decades, Tammany Hall had been the most famous political machine in America, and while its power had shifted over time, its habits were still deeply felt in public life. Jobs, nominations, favors, contracts, judgeships, and protection could all move through channels that were not visible to the public. A man didn't need to be a criminal to benefit from that system. He only had to understand how it worked. Crater understood enough to rise inside it. His legal career was tied to Democratic politics, and his appointment to the bench did not come out of nowhere. One of the names close to this would be Martin J. Healy, a Tammany figure connected to the Cayuga Club, one of those political gathering places where loyalty and opportunity could become difficult to separate. Healy's circle was not simply a backdrop of smoke-filled rooms and handshakes. It was part of the practical network of influence, the place where public office could begin as a private conversation. By 1930, that older order was under strain. New York's courts and political appointments were drawing scrutiny, and one of the scandals hanging over the city involved George F. Ewald, a magistrate whose name became tied to allegations about the buying and selling of judicial office. The Ewald affair belonged to a wider argument over whether judgeships were being treated as public trusts or political rewards, and Crater's recent appointment made his disappearance feel connected to that climate almost as soon as the public learned he was gone. Crater did not have to disappear because of the Ewald scandal for people to see the connection. When a newly appointed judge vanished after moving papers, withdrawing cash, and slipping out of sight, New Yorkers already had a language for suspicion. They knew about Tammany. They knew about favors. They knew that a seat on the bench could be worth more than the salary attached to it. If Crater had enemies, debts, obligations, or knowledge that embarrassed the wrong people, that could spell trouble. And this was not only newspaper talk. Reformers and investigators were pushing into the city's old arrangements, and Samuel Seabury would become one of the central names in that anti-corruption drive. His investigations exposed deep connections between politics, courts, police practices, vice, and municipal power. Crater vanished before that story had fully unfolded in public, but not before the old understandings were already under pressure. The official investigation into Crater's disappearance would go to the office of District Attorney Thomas C.T. Crane, another figure bound to the politics of New York City. Crane's role would later draw criticism from those who believed the investigation had never reached into the forces behind Crater's appointment. Whether that criticism was fair in every detail is much harder to say, but what is clear is that the people responsible for finding Crater were not fully outside the politics being questioned. That is one reason the case never felt like an ordinary missing person story. Crater was a judge, newly elevated, politically connected, and missing at a moment when New York's courts were already being challenged in public. His absence created a vacuum, and into that vacuum rushed every fear people already had about the city. That justice could be bought, that politicians protected their own, that police and prosecutors knew more than they said, and that Broadway's bright surface sat close to a darker economy of favors, sex, money, silence, and sometimes violence. By the summer of 1930, the courts had already recessed, and Joseph and Stella Crater were spending time away from New York at Belgrade Lakes, Maine. It was the kind of place that seemed to belong to another life: quiet water, summer houses, and distance from the city. For anyone tied to New York's courts and politics, Maine offered serenity. That serenity did not last. One of the best-known stories in the case says that Crater received a phone call late in July and told Stella he had to return to New York to straighten those fellows out. It is a memorable line, and it has survived because it seems to point toward pressure, conflict, and unfinished business. But like many details in the Crater case, it's hard to pin down. That line belongs to the tradition of the case, and it may reflect something real, but it shouldn't be treated as direct evidence. What can be said is that Crater's movements in the days before August 6th are not as settled as later versions often make them sound. Some accounts have him returning from Maine to New York around August 3rd. Others place him in Maine at the time or suggest that he had already been moving between places before his final day in the city. There are stories of a trip to Atlantic City, sometimes connected to Sally Lou Ritz, the showgirl who would later dine with him on the night he vanished. What should be a simple route back to Manhattan becomes instead a loose trail through New York, Maine, and possibly Atlantic City. It's very convoluted. Either way, the days before August 6th are hard to read. If the phone call story is true, then Crater believed something in New York needed his attention. If the reports about Maine, New York, and possibly Atlantic City are all circling the truth, then his movements were less orderly than a simple return from vacation. What should be a straightforward trip back to Manhattan becomes a broken trail of calls, travel, rumors, and half-known plans. There were other fragments, too. Around this same period, the New Yorker reported that a lawyer had been consulted by a woman using the name Lorraine Fay about a possible breach of promise suit against Carter. A claim like that carried a particular kind of danger in 1930. It didn't need to be true in every detail to be damaging. A judge newly placed on the bench, tied to machine politics, surrounded by rumors of women and money, could be harmed by the appearance of scandal almost as much as by scandal itself. Lorraine Fay does not solve the case. Neither does the rumored phone call or the possible Atlantic City trip, or the confusion over exactly where Carter was on August 3rd, 4th, and 5th. But together they make the days before his disappearance feel very unsettled and weird. Crater was not moving toward August 6th from a position of stillness. He appears in the record as a man shifting between places, answering some pressures from the city, surrounded by stories that may be partly true, partly distorted, and partly the result of everyone trying to explain him after he was gone. On August 5th, he was reportedly back in his chambers in Manhattan. According to one contemporary account, he spoke with a courthouse reporter about the judicial scandals then troubling New York and joked, "Who's next?" It may have been nothing more than the ordinary gallows humor of men who worked around politics and scandal. Only afterward did it take on a colder sound. The next morning, Crater returned to the courthouse. From that point, the record becomes clearer and the last confirmed day of his life in public view begins. On the morning of August 6, 1930, Crater was back at 60 Center Street. He was in his chambers going through papers and working with Joseph L. Mara, his clerk and assistant. Mara was with him through much of the morning. Crater sorted through material on his desk, destroyed some of it, gathered the rest into briefcases or portfolios, and then sent Mara out to cash 2 checks. Together they came to $5,150, a large sum of money at the time. Those actions may have had ordinary explanations. A judge could have summer paperwork to clear, private files to move, or cash he wanted for reasons no one else needed to know about. Whatever he removed from the courthouse was never accounted for, and no one could say why he needed that much money on the last day anyone saw him. It is curious. Once Mara had the money, the day moved from the courthouse to Crater's apartment at 45th Avenue. Crater and Mara carried the locked briefcases or portfolios from the courthouse to the apartment, bringing the papers out of the official setting and into Crater's private rooms. There, Mara was dismissed. From that point on, the day becomes harder to follow. Crater had moved documents, collected cash, and separated himself from the man who witnessed the morning's activities. Before he disappeared into the afternoon, Crater reportedly said something about going up Westchester Way for a swim. It is one of those small remarks that the case has preserved because it seems to point in several different directions. It may have been a casual comment, a real plan, a cover story, or a way of making his absence seem ordinary for a few hours. Nothing in the known record proves that he went swimming or even that he meant to. The phrase remains because it sounds like a door half opened and left that way. Later that day, he reserved a ticket for Dancing Partner, a play then running in the Broadway district. The ticket was later picked up, but there are no eyewitness accounts that place Crater at the theater. A theater ticket suggests a plan, or at least the appearance of one, again, like the swimming thing earlier. It places him near the district where he would later dine, and it raises the possibility that he expected to go somewhere after dinner, meet someone, or create the impression that he was having a normal evening. By evening, he was at Billy Haas's Chop House on West 45th Street. The restaurant sat near Times Square, in the crowded theater district of Midtown Manhattan, close to the lights, noise, and movement of Broadway. Crater was there with the aforementioned William Klein, a lawyer and friend, and Sally Lou Ritz, the showgirl. Their presence has always given the final scene its particular edge. A judge newly raised to the bench, a lawyer from his social circle, and a young woman connected to the theater life that ran alongside New York politics more closely than polite society liked to admit. There is no need to turn the dinner into something it may not have been. Crater knew theatrical people. Men in his position often moved between courthouse offices, private clubs, restaurants, and Broadway company. A dinner with Klein and Ritz was not proof of a plot, but as the last known social scene of his life, it becomes impossible to ignore. The details of the last meal are less revealing than the fact that it happened at all. Crater was not hiding in a simple sense. He was moving through public, seen by people who knew him, behaving well enough that no one at the table seems to have understood they were part of the final record. If he was afraid, he didn't make it obvious. If he was planning to disappear, he allowed himself to be seen almost until the end. If someone else was watching him, the city gave them cover. After dinner, the version of this case that became famous came from Crater's two companions. They said that Crater got into a taxi outside the restaurant around 9:30 p.m. and rode west on 45th Street. That image became the legend, the judge stepping into a cab and disappearing forever into Manhattan. But even that last sighting changed. Later accounts say Klein and Ritz switched their stories, saying they were the ones who took the cab while Crater walked away. Just a little bit suspicious. After leaving Billy Haas's, Crater dropped out of the confirmed record. No reliable witnesses place him at the theater. No one produced a letter explaining his movements. No body appeared in an alley, a river, a hotel, or a room rented under another name. The city that had seen him all day simply lost track of him. In the days immediately afterward, the people around Crater did not respond as if a judge had been swallowed by New York. Some assumed he was away on personal business. Others expected him to reappear. Stella waited for him in Maine, where he was supposed to return for her birthday on August 9th. His absence was bizarre, but for a time it remained private, held inside the circle of people who knew him well enough to worry and also well enough to make excuses. Part of the difficulty was Crater himself. He was a grown man with a lot of money, legal work, political obligations, and a private life that was not always simple. A judge could travel, a lawyer could be called away, a husband could delay his return and send word later. The same freedom and status that made his disappearance shocking also gave people room, at first at least, to imagine that he was somewhere else by choice. Stella waited in Maine while friends and associates in New York tried to make sense of his absence. There were inquiries, conversations, and informal efforts to locate him, but the case did not begin with the urgency people might expect in hindsight. It began with uncertainty. Had he gone away on business? Was he avoiding someone? Had he gone into hiding for reasons of his own? Was this personal, political, or simply embarrassing? The longer those questions remained inside Crater's private circle, the more time that traces of him could fade. One of the first people drawn in was Leo Lowenthal, a detective and friend of Crater's, who visited the apartment before the case became public. He found signs that Crater had been there. His vest, watch and chain, card case, and fountain pen were all reportedly on the desk, and mail had begun to pile up. Now that's very strange in and of itself because it suggests he may have left in a hurry without his personal belongings. Anybody who has watched or read true crime knows that this sort of scene is pretty common in missing persons and murder cases. Furthermore, the papers Crater had carried from the courthouse were simply not there. If those documents could explain what he was doing on August 6th, they had already disappeared from the apartment before any formal search began. Delaying the formal search was foolish because the trail was still fresh in August. Waiters at Billy Haas's, people on West 45th Street, cab drivers, theater workers, doormen, and hotel clerks might have remembered something useful if police had started asking questions and searching right away. By September, those same memories had been mixed with routine, rumor, and time. The city had kept moving, and Crater's last night had already become harder to reconstruct. The delay also changed the testimony. People had time to worry, compare impressions, protect themselves, and hear what others believed happened. That doesn't make every later statement false, but it does mean the accounts came through weeks of private conversations before they reached police in any formal way. In a case built from small details, that lost time made the record harder to trust. The matter was finally brought to police on September 3rd, nearly a month after Crater had been last seen. Simon H. Rifkind, connected to Carter through his legal circle, was the man who helped push the disappearance into official view. Once that happened, the story changed completely. What had been a private absence became a public event, and the missing judge was no longer simply Stella's husband, a friend, or a political associate who had failed to return. He was a vanished member of the judiciary in a city already uneasy about its courts. That month of silence and hesitation became one of the permanent problems in the case. It left investigators chasing a man who had disappeared from one of the busiest parts of New York, but only after the best witnesses had been given time to forget him. From the beginning, the official search for Joseph was not really beginning at the beginning. It was handicapped and weeks late. Once his absence became public, the story moved quickly from private concern to public spectacle. By then, the city was not being asked to look for a man who had failed to come home the night before. It was being asked to reconstruct the movements of someone who had disappeared almost a month ago. The newspapers seized on the case immediately. Crater's name appeared in headlines, his last known movements were repeated and rearranged, and the known details began to harden into the familiar pattern of the mystery. In the press, each piece had a different meaning depending on the theory attached to it. The cash could mean escape, blackmail, or bribery. The documents he brought to his apartment could be a dangerous secret or nothing at all. The dinner could be innocent, social, romantic, or part of some larger arrangement. Police circulars reduced Crater to the kind of description used for any missing man, though there was nothing ordinary about the case behind it. He was described at 6 feet tall and 185 pounds, with mixed gray hair, brown eyes, false teeth, and a damaged fingertip. He had been wearing a brown suit with a narrow green stripe, a Panama hat, glasses, and a Masonic ring. The search spread far beyond New York. Thousands of circulars were distributed, rewards were offered, and reports came in from across the country and beyond. In places where a man might go to disappear, or where a witness might convince himself that he had recognized a famous face. Some of the reports were sincere, others were confused, opportunistic, or plainly false. The more famous Crater became, the harder it was to know whether people were remembering him or remembering the newspapers. There were letters, tips, sightings, rumors, and claims that moved through police offices and post offices and newsrooms together. A missing judge was the kind of story that invited every kind of explanation. Some saw the hand of Tammany Hall. Some saw a woman, a debt, a criminal arrangement, or a private collapse. Others imagined Crater alive somewhere under a different name, having escaped the city before the walls closed in. The investigation had to operate inside that noise, separating possible evidence from the growing folklore of the case. The grand jury began its work in the fall of 1930. Witnesses were called, testimony was taken, and the panel tried to impose order on a disappearance that had already become crowded with speculation. It heard from people connected to Crater's legal work, his social life, his last known movements, and the unusual activity on August 6th. It examined the known pieces of that day and the weeks that followed, but the uncertainty remained. The problem was that the evidence did not point in a specific direction. Crater might have been alive and hiding, dead by violence, dead by his own hand, suffering from some unknown condition, or removed from the city by people whose names never reached the record. Each possibility could borrow a few facts from the case, but none could claim them all. By January 1931, the grand jury still had no answer. After hearing witnesses and reviewing the case, it concluded that the evidence was not enough to say whether Crater was alive or dead, whether he had left voluntarily, suffered some kind of amnesia, or fallen victim to a crime of some sort. The investigation had produced testimony and possibilities, but no finding that settled the case. The public search did not end with the grand jury. Crater's name remained useful to newspapers, comedians, rumor mongers, and anyone who had a theory about the city. For years afterward, the supposed sightings continued. His absence became a reference point, almost a phrase people could use when something disappeared completely. But beneath the jokes and headlines, the investigation had found something colder. New York had looked for one of its own judges and found only fragments. Then, just as the official inquiry was losing force, the case changed again. The next major discovery did not come from a witness, a detective, or a political enemy. It came from Stella Crater herself, inside the apartment where her husband had carried papers on the day he vanished. In January of 1931, Stella found 4 envelopes in the apartment. They contained $6,619 in cash, checks, insurance policies worth $30,000, and a 3-page handwritten list of people and companies who owed Crater money. On that list, Crater had added a scrawled line usually read as, "Am very weary. Love, Joe." The envelopes complicated one of the simplest explanations for his disappearance. If Crater had withdrawn money because he meant to run, then why was so much cash still in the apartment months later? And if someone had killed him for money, why had all that money been left behind? The discovery did not rule out escape, blackmail, or violence, but it made each of them harder to explain. Also, the note carried a different kind of weight. "Am very weary" can sound like exhaustion, despair, resignation, or a private message from a man who knew he was under serious strain or danger. It is tempting to hear it as a farewell, but the words do not explain what happened after he wrote them. They don't say where he was going, who he feared, what he had done, or whether he expected to return. But those words are intimate, and it shows a man struggling, in one way or another. There was another problem. The apartment had already been part of the investigation. If the envelopes had been there all along, why had they not been found earlier? The answer may be ordinary. Searches can be incomplete, objects can be overlooked, and a private apartment can contain more hiding places than a police report suggests. But the timing of the discovery added another layer of unease. In a case already marked by delay, missing papers, and uncertain accounts, the sudden appearance of money and a weary note did not feel like a solution. It felt like one more thing that should have been found sooner. For Stella, the envelopes were not just evidence. They were something left behind by her husband months after the city had failed to find him. The line on the list, "Am very weary. Love, Joe," only made that absence harder. In the moment she read those words, he probably felt close, almost close enough to touch. What did he mean by saying he was weary? Was he afraid, ashamed, exhausted? Saying goodbye, taking off? Nobody knows. What it did do was to bring his voice back into the room without bringing him back with it. One major possibility is that Crater was killed because he had become useful to the wrong people, and then dangerous to them. A newly appointed judge could know how favors were traded, how appointments were arranged, who had paid whom, and which names were attached to which promises. If Crater had papers, debts, or private knowledge that could embarrass men with power, murder becomes easier to understand, not as random violence, but as damage control. That reading makes the final day look darker. The papers, cash, the trip to 45th Avenue, and the sudden break in the trail could all suggest a man handling something urgent. Maybe he was preparing to bargain. Maybe he was trying to settle a threat or a debt. Maybe he was moving material he did not want left in his chambers. But those same details can also point in another direction. A man gathering money and removing papers might be preparing to run, hide, or simply to buy himself time. That's the major problem with the political theory. It does fit the city, it fits the pressure around the courts, it even fits the timing. But it cannot supply the missing pieces. It doesn't solve the case. There are also attempts to explain Crater's disappearance through private scandal and blackmail, but that part of the case is relatively thin. Lorraine Fay's reported breach of promise claim could have embarrassed him or cost him money, but it's hard to see that alone making a judge vanish. Sally Lou Ritz mattered because she was with Crater on the night he disappeared, but there's no evidence of an affair or plot or anything of the like. Other names were pulled into the same theory later, especially June Bryce. She was a woman from Crater's Broadway circle, reportedly seen speaking with him shortly before he vanished. In the version later published by Emil Ellis, Stella Crater's lawyer, Bryce was tied to the threat Crater may have been trying to pay off. The idea was that the $5,150 withdrawn on August 6th was not escape money or ordinary private cash, but money connected to blackmail. Bryce then disappeared from view around the time of the grand jury inquiry, and years later, in 1948, she was located in a mental hospital. Those details make the story more memorable on the surface, but less believable, less steady. Faye, Ritz, and Bryce show how easily Crater's private life could be pulled into suspicion. However, again, they don't give us an answer. Now we have to talk about Vivian Gordon. She was not part of Crater's final night. She enters the story from a different direction, through New York's overlapping worlds of prostitution, blackmail claims, wealthy men, gangland figures, and police corruption. The most direct link was the reported discovery of one of Crater's jackets in her apartment. The jacket is one of the strangest details in this case. Most of the case is built from fragments, uncertain sightings, missing papers, political rumors, names repeated by people who may or may not have known anything. But a judge's jacket reportedly turning up in Vivian Gordon's apartment is quite different. It suggests proximity. It suggests that Gordon was not merely part of the same world of vice, money, and corruption, but may have been closer to Crater's private life than the public record ever explained. It raises obvious questions. Did Crater leave it there himself? Was it given to her? Was it planted, maybe? Had Gordon seen something? Had she known something? We won't ever know for sure, but it is very peculiar. And Gordon had been convicted of prostitution years earlier, though she insisted the case was a frame job. By 1931, she was being tied by investigators to various forms of vice, blackmail, powerful men, and corrupt police. She claimed that a police officer and others had framed her in a case that cost her custody of her daughter. In February of that year, she began speaking with a lawyer connected to the Seabury investigation. 5 days later, she was dead. This makes it even stranger still. Late one night, Gordon left her Manhattan apartment and got into a car. By morning, her body was found in Van Cortlandt Park. She had been beaten and strangled. Some of her expensive belongings were missing, so robbery remained possible, but the timing made that explanation feel incomplete. Her apartment reportedly contained diaries and names, the kind of material that could make powerful men nervous. Gordon's murder did not solve Crater's disappearance, it did not prove that he was killed over blackmail, but it shows why the blackmail theory could not be completely brushed aside as pure fantasy. Crater turned up missing, Gordon was murdered, and his jacket was found in her place. Another possibility begins with Crater himself. If the papers, cash, apartment trip, theater ticket, and loose final movements are read as preparation, then Crater becomes not the victim of a plot but the author of his own absence. He may have known that the political scandal was coming. He may have feared exposure through women, money, or both, or something else. He may have decided that the life he had built was about to collapse and that disappearance offered the only remaining exit. The voluntary disappearance theory survives because Crater had time, lots of money, and a month-long head start before police treated him as missing. That is enough to keep the idea alive for sure, but it doesn't explain the harder questions. Why leave so much behind? Why abandon his position? Why abandon his wife? And why never surface again even after the case became national news? Also, escape creates its own problems. Like we talked about earlier, Stella later found money and insurance papers in the apartment, which makes Crater look like a man who didn't take everything he needed to vanish. And once the case became national news, hiding would have become harder with each passing week. A second life was certainly possible, but it would have required help, a lot of discipline, and really a lot of luck. No confirmed trace of a second life ever appeared. There is another possibility, older and more sordid, that Crater died accidentally in a compromising place and that others covered it up. In this version, he leaves the restaurant and goes somewhere private. A brothel, an apartment, a nightclub perhaps. Something happens there, a sudden death, a medical emergency, violence that wasn't planned, or a panic among people who cannot afford to call the police. The body was hidden not because Crater was carrying a grand political secret, but because everyone present has something to lose. This theory is usually tied to Polly Adler, one of New York's most famous madams. Adler ran high-end brothels for men with money, status, and secrets. Her business depended on privacy, police protection, and the steady flow of clients who could not afford public embarrassment. If a Tammany Hall judge died suddenly in a brothel or private apartment, the people around him had every reason to panic. Calling the police could expose the house, the clients, the payoffs, and the names behind them. In that version of the story, Crater was not murdered for politics or blackmail. He died in the wrong place, and the body was removed to protect the people who witnessed it. This theory explains why there was no public crime scene and why people around Broadway, brothels, or protected nightlife might have kept quiet. It also fits the New York City of the time, where police corruption and underworld favors could make a body disappear relatively easily. The weakness in that theory starts where the evidence ends. No reliable witness places Crater in a brothel. Simple as that. It also leaves the papers, the money, and the strange preparation earlier that day only partly explained. Of course, suicide is another reading, especially after considering the note mentioned earlier. "Am very weary" is a small phrase, but it carries a great deal of emotional weight. It sounds like a man worn down by something. Combined with his movements on August 6th, it can seem like he was preparing for the end. Yet the suicide idea explains a mood more easily than a disappearance. Again, there was no body, no clear method, no confirmed final location, and no note that plainly says goodbye. Just, "am weary." The phrase to Stella may have been a farewell, but it also may have been part of a financial or domestic message written by a tired husband who expected some future reckoning. The last major theory, believe it or not, arrived decades later in 2005, after the death of one Stella Ferrucci-Good, a woman from Queens. By the way, this Stella has nothing to do with Stella Crater. Just wanted to make that clear. Anyway, her family found a sealed letter she had left behind, marked not to be opened until after her death. In it, she claimed that her husband had once told her what happened to Crater. According to Ferrucci-Good, Crater had been killed by Charles Burns, an NYPD officer, and Burns's brother Frank, a cab driver. She said Crater's body was buried under West 8th Street in Coney Island, close to the place where the New York Aquarium was later built. It was the kind of late solution people want in a case like this: names, a burial place, and the feeling that an old family secret had finally surfaced. It was a very compelling lead and certainly deserved attention. Police looked into the Ferrucci-Good letter and found that the area she named had already been excavated in the 1950s during construction of the New York Aquarium. That didn't make the story impossible, however. Construction crews digging foundations and utilities would not have been searching carefully for the remains of a judge who vanished decades earlier, and bones could have been missed, disturbed, or never recognized for what they were. But investigators reportedly found no record of Crater's remains being discovered there, and I found no clear evidence that the site was physically excavated again after the letter surfaced. The letter does remain as one of the more specific leads late in the case, but that's what it remains, just a lead. And personally, out of curiosity, I would like to see the place excavated again. Now, I don't think they'd find anything, but yeah, it would be interesting. This is a haunting case. Now, all these theories do not cancel one another so much as overlap. A political murder could have used underworld help. A blackmail problem could have become political because the people involved moved through the same circles. A voluntary disappearance could have been driven by fear of corruption hearings, private scandal, or both. A suicide could have been preceded by the same pressures that made murder seem plausible. Even the weaker theories survive because the core facts leave room around them. This is why the Crater case has lasted. It's not empty. If anything, it's too crowded. Too many people had reasons to worry, too many institutions had reasons to avoid embarrassment, and too many pieces of the last day can be made to point in more than one direction. I think the safest conclusion is also the least satisfying. Joseph Force Crater probably vanished because several dangerous parts of his life had begun to touch at once. Whether one of those parts killed him, frightened him into running, drove him toward despair, or merely created a fog around a more ordinary death, is the question that we will likely never answer. In 1939, almost 9 years after he walked out of Billy Haas's, Joseph was declared legally dead. It is just a massive mystery and a century-old door that has never been closed. Of course, the mystery kept resurfacing long after the investigations faded. Sightings came and went, tips arrived, buried body rumors spread. In 1979, the NYPD formally closed the case. And of course, like we discussed before, the Ferrucci-Good letter briefly brought Carter back into the news with names, a claimed burial place near Coney Island, and the promise of an answer. That answer never came. So the same questions remain. What was in the papers Carter removed from his chambers? Why did he need more than $5,000 in cash? Did he ever use the theater ticket? What really happened after he left Billy Haas's? And why did Stella find those envelopes so many months later? Lastly, why those two haunting lines? Am very weary. Love, Joe. Crater was not a magic trick, a punchline, or a shadow invented by the tabloids. He was a husband, lawyer, judge, political beneficiary, and a very flawed man with private habits and public importance. He vanished from one of the busiest cities in America and the world, and left behind just enough evidence to suggest almost everything, but answer nothing. If Judge Crater was murdered, the city protected his killer by accident, indifference, or by design. If he ran, he escaped more completely than almost anyone of his time. If he died by his own hand, he found a way to leave no body and no certain farewell. And if the truth was smaller, uglier, or more ordinary than legend suggests, it was still powerful enough to vanish a judge from New York and keep him missing forever. In the end, Crater's disappearance is not only a question of where he went, it is a question of what kind of city could lose him so completely, and what kind of men around him may have preferred that he stayed lost. Hey guys, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. And if you like what I'm doing here, please consider subscribing or liking. It'll really help the channel grow. So, until next time, take care and good health.